After the 8 night visions in the book of Zechariah, we now come to 3 oracles that will conclude the first half of the book. And in these 3 oracles, each of them are going to begin with the language, the word of the Lord, or the word of Yahweh came to me, which is sort of the standard language for prophetic oracles. However, there is a difference in that the night visions were in a word, they were visionary. These are things that Zechariah saw, whereas now when we come to the 3 oracles that conclude the first part of the book, these will be words of the Lord that came to Yahweh, so visionary, and more in a historical setting. And so these are the 3 oracles that will conclude the first half of the book. There's an oracle about the crown of Joshua. There is an oracle about true fasting, and then there will be an oracle about Jerusalem as the city of truth and Zion as the holy mountain. So we will look at each of these in turn, beginning with the oracle about Joshua's crown, which begins in chapter 6 and verse 9. Exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem are continuing to come back and forth, and one of the groups brought a number of precious metals with them as gifts by the returned exiles to be contributed to the temple project. Zechariah is now instructed to use the gold of these metals and silver of these metals to make a special crown to honor Joshua. This crown was to be set upon the head of the high priest, but then as this crown is set upon the head of the high priest, a pronouncement is to be made. Here is the man whose name is Branch. Now, presumably that statement is directed to Zerubbabel rather than to Joshua, since associated with that statement is the statement that the one who is the branch is the one who is to build the temple of the Lord. And of course, as you look at chapter 6 and verse 12 and even back to chapter 4 and verse 9, it is Zerubbabel, the governor, who is the primary leader responsible for the construction of the temple. So in a sense, there are 2 figures in view here. There is the figure of the high priest, upon whom the crown is set, who is the priestly line, and then there is Zerubbabel, who is called the branch, who is the royal line. So Joshua, the high priest, figures in this announcement because he's the priestly leader. As the priestly leader, he is the spiritual representative of the community, and the fact that he is crowned, but Zerubbabel is announced, anticipates something that is especially described in chapter 6 and verse 13. And we really ought to look at that passage briefly. It says, "It is he who shall build the temple of Yahweh," this is the branch, "and shall bear royal honor, and shall sit and rule upon his throne. And there shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both." This statement seems to suggest that Joshua is crowned, Zerubbabel is announced, but that both of them are going to sit on thrones, symbolically representing their leadership in the rebuilding of the second temple. And furthermore, that the priestly line, which is represented by Joshua the high priest, and the kingly or royal line, which is represented by Zerubbabel, the priestly line, which is represented by Joshua, and the royal line, which is represented by Zerubbabel, are now going to come together in their leadership of the community to rebuild the temple. And so this is a really important idea, the union of the priesthood and the kingship in the future. Now I need to say a word about this metaphor of the branch. This may not immediately be apparent to the reader of the book of Zechariah, but this goes back actually all the way to the prophet Isaiah. The meaning of the branch begins with a metaphor that Isaiah uses in the early part of his work, in which the people of Israel and Judah are going to be cut down like forests and the trees. The invasion of the northern enemies, the Assyrians and eventually the Babylonians, would cut down the people of Judah so that they're like a forest that is cut down. There will only be stumps left in the land. And it is out of these stumps that then Isaiah says in chapter 11, there will be a small branch that will grow out of the stump of the family of Jesse. Now, normally in Isaiah 11, we read this verse at Christmas time. We read about the stump of Jesse and the branch that comes out of the stump of Jesse as a sign pointing to Jesus as the Messiah, and that's entirely appropriate. But the idea of the branch is the idea of a little root or a little branch that grows out of one of the stumps of the families that were cut down. And this branch would become the pride and the glory of all of the survivors of the exile. Then, about a century later, this metaphor of the branch is going to be used once again, this time by the prophet Jeremiah. And he is going to describe the coming of the Messiah, the branch from the family of David. So Jeremiah is picking up on the idea that Isaiah used. Now in Zechariah, Zechariah is picking up on the ideas from both Isaiah and Jeremiah that the branch is going to find its resolution in the man Zerubbabel. Now you may remember that Zerubbabel is a descendant of King Jehoiakim. So Zerubbabel is in the royal family line of David. And so Zechariah now draws upon this metaphor to describe Zerubbabel as the man whose name is Branch. And he is the one who will build the temple of the Lord. So there is a coming priest king. This idea that the royal line and the priestly line are going to come together. This is a reflection that is very similar to what you find in Psalm 110, which unites the role of the kingship and the priesthood in the future of the dynasty of David. Now, Zechariah's oracle unites the branch and the priest who work together to accomplish God's purpose in the rebuilding of the Second Temple. Zerubbabel, the royal line, and Joshua, the priestly line, serve as typological links to the messianic future. In fact, as we remember back in chapter 3, they are a symbol of things to come. And so the reference to building the temple, which is going to be accomplished not only by those who are working with Joshua and Zerubbabel, but they will be joined by those who are far away, as it says in chapter 6 and verse 15. This links the building of the Second Temple to the messianic future. And there are echoes of this that stretch all the way to the time of Jesus in the New Testament. The language, those far away, is a way of talking about those nations that were non-Jewish. And of course, in the preaching of Jesus, he himself says that he has sheep which are not of this fold, and he will bring them in as well. And then at the end of the Gospels, there is the great commission of Jesus to the disciples that they should go to the nations and to give the gospel to them. And so probably this language here of those from far away coming to help Zerubbabel and Joshua is sort of an anticipation of what will happen later in the New Testament. The fact that Joshua's crown is kept as a memorial in the temple also points to the future, and beyond just the immediate future. So this is a sign for days to come. The second oracle is about true fasting. It starts actually with some actual fasts that were being observed by the people in Judah. And this oracle comes about 2 years after the previous one, and it addresses this question about ritual fasts. The new temple was in the process of being built, and in that context, the question was posed to Zechariah whether or not it was appropriate to continue to observe the fasts that remembered the fall of the first temple. And so you need to understand something about the fasts that are happening at this time. You find them mentioned not only in the book of Zechariah, but they're also mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, in the book of 2 Kings, and so on, because there are 4 major dates that become fast days every year for the Jews. The first one is the fast of the 10th month, which remembers the siege against Jerusalem that began when Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded the city back in the book of 2 Kings 25. Then they observed a fast day in the 4th month. This was to remember the day in which the wall of Jerusalem was breached. Once the wall was breached, they were very near the end, because the breaching of the wall signaled that the Babylonian armies would now be able to come into the city and they would destroy the sanctuary in the city itself. The third fast is the fast of the 5th month. This is the one in particular that is being asked about in this passage in Zechariah 7, because this fast in the 5th month is a memory of the destruction of the temple, when the Babylonian armies burned the temple to the ground, smashed all the paneling, stole booty from the temple, and brought it to its end. And then finally, there is a fourth fast they were observing, a fast in the 7th month, which remembered the assassination of Gedaliah. Now, this is an incident that is probably less well known than some of the others, but the Babylonians put a governor over Jerusalem by the name of Gedaliah, and he was assassinated by some zealots. This threw such a panic into the people in Jerusalem because they assumed that with the assassination of the Babylonian governor that Nebuchadnezzar would bring back his armies to Jerusalem and just pretty much kill everybody in sight. So many of the Jews at that time decided that their best option would be to flee as exiles to Egypt. And they did so. They actually took Jeremiah with them. And they fled to Egypt, and they began the beginnings of a Jewish community living in Egypt. So there was a fast for this as well, because it commemorates the exile of people not only now to Babylon, but now a group that are going to be exiled in Egypt. So all 4 of these fasts are being observed. One fast in particular, though, they ask about, and this is the fast of the 5th month, in which they remembered the destruction of the temple. Well, interestingly enough, as they pose this question, Zechariah's response is not to answer immediately whether they should or should not keep this fast. Rather, he raises the more basic issue of what is the nature of fasting? Why should a person fast in the first place? And is it appropriate to fast? What is the nature of true fasting? Was fasting truly out of respect for the Lord? Or were they just simply fasting because they were sorry for what happened? They regretted the destruction and the loss of the temple. And Zechariah raises the bar. He raises their view about the nature of true fasting and says that in true fasting, there must be a component of social justice. There must be an intent to show mercy and compassion for the powerless and the disadvantaged. You'll see that clearly spelled out in chapter 7, where he speaks of the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, the poor, those people who were at the most disadvantage in society. And if a person is going to fast, then fasting must somehow be related to social justice. For instance, if I'm going to fast food, for instance, it's not just enough for me to do without food. Rather, I need to use the food that I'm saving because I'm not eating it to bless someone else, to bless the poor, to give to someone who is in need. And it is in fact by ignoring those features of the law of God that the earlier prophets had preached about the incitement of God's anger against the Israelites, and in fact that led to exile. If you go back to the prophets in the 8th century, Amos and Hosea and Micah, those prophets had a very strong sense of social justice and the oppression of the poor, the exploitation of those who were at a disadvantage were one of the reasons why the people of Israel and Judah went into exile in the first place. And so now that they are coming back from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild, it was really important that if they were going to fast, they need to think about the nature of fasting. The nature of fasting is not simply to deprive yourself of food. It is to use your resources for the help of those who are most in need. This idea of social justice. Now, the actual answer to the question, should we continue this fast in the 5th month? Zechariah is not actually going to answer that immediately. That is going to be in the 3rd oracle that he's going to give. But he will answer that question eventually in chapter 8. And that brings us then to chapter 8, which is kind of a summary oracle. In this 3rd oracle, Zechariah is going to enumerate 10 promises that describe blessing for the community as they're rebuilding the temple. Each of these promises begins with the identical same formula. Thus says Yahweh Sabaoth. And so you'll find that 10 times in chapter 8. Now, in these 10 promises, much of these promises are going to connect with things that have been said earlier in the book. So the various promises will recall some themes that you find earlier, not only in the book of Zechariah, but even in the book of Haggai. So we want to look very briefly at least at each of these 10 promises. The first one has to do with the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem and Mount Zion, and his passion is strong for the rebuilding project. In chapter 8, if you're reading a version such as the English Standard Version, it will use the word jealous. And I think I mentioned in a previous description that when we run into the word jealous, we should not think of this in the common way that most English people think of it, and that is concerning envy or spite, but rather we should think of jealousy in the sense of passion or zeal. So the zeal of the Lord was burning hot. The passion of the Lord was very strong for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. He had chosen Jerusalem once in the time of David. Now he is choosing Jerusalem again. He is choosing Mount Zion, the place for the second temple to be built. Then in verse 3, there is a very brief description of the holy mountain, which is Mount Zion, and the city of truth, which is Jerusalem. And these entities, Jerusalem and the holy mountain, are going to be reclaimed from their former faithlessness and defilement. So it says, "Thus says Yahweh, I have returned to Zion and will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will be called the faithful city." Once Jerusalem was the very unfaithful city, which led to its exile. Now it is going to be the faithful city. And the mountain of Yahweh Sabaoth will be called the holy mountain. Once the mountain of Zion and the temple on Mount Zion was desecrated. You may remember in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel has a vision of the temple and he sees all kinds of desecration going on inside the temple. People worshiping the god Shamash, people bowing down to the various deities of the Babylonian Empire. And now that desecration that once happened, that made God abandon the temple, that's going to be changed. And Mount Zion is going to be called the Holy Mountain. The third promise comes in verses 4 and 5. And here it says, "Thus says Yahweh Sabaoth, old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with staff in hand because of great age. And the streets of the city will be full of boys and girls playing in the streets." This is a vision of peacefulness. This is a vision that anticipates that the future of the city of Jerusalem will be good. People will live to an old age, which means that they will not suffer loss of life early by war or deprivation. And the imagery of boys and girls playing in the street, children playing in the streets, is the image of a time of peacefulness. So peacefulness is going to characterize the city in the future. Then in verse 6, there is the fourth of the promises. This one in the form of a question. "Thus says Yahweh Sabaoth, if it is marvelous in the sight of the remnant of this people in these days, should it also be marvelous in my sight, declares Yahweh Sabaoth?" The word that is translated marvelous in some English versions is translated impossible. Will it seem impossible to me? Either of those translations is quite adequate, but the point is that even though this seems to be such a marvelous possible future for the people of Jerusalem, will this be a surprise to God? Will this be impossible for God? Actually, the answer, of course, is no. God is not surprised because he has planned this all along. It is not impossible for God because nothing is impossible for God. God's promises might seem to be wonderful and marvelous and far beyond what was expected, but they are not too hard for him to fulfill. Then in the fifth promise, which is in verses 7 and 8, "Thus says Yahweh Sabaoth, behold, I will save my people from the east country and from the west, and bring them to dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God in faithfulness and in righteousness." This is a description of the regathering of the elect of God, and it is directly associated with his dwelling among them as their God, which is the covenant formulary. In the sixth promise, and this one is more lengthy, this starts in verse 9 and extends all the way through verse 13, but it describes how that in the past their times had been very difficult. They had faced opposition, they had faced drought, they had faced crop failure, they had faced marginal conditions where people were hungry, people were thirsty, but now all of that's going to be changed. And so what the Lord says in this promise is, let your hands be strong. Since now you have been hearing the words of the prophets who have encouraged you to engage once again in rebuilding the temple, continue that work. Let your hands be strong. In the former days, there was no wages, there was no safety, there was a lot of controversy, there was a lot of opposition. But now God says, I will not deal with this remnant of the people as in the former days. Now there's going to be a sowing of peace. The vine will give its fruit, and the ground shall give its produce, and the heavens will give dew, and all the remnant of the people will possess all of these things. In other words, there's a time of blessing that's coming because they have put their hands to the work of rebuilding the second temple. And because they were faithful in keeping or in fulfilling God's purpose for them, God would be faithful because they had kept His word. In the seventh promise, which begins in verse 14, the terrible judgment of the exile is now reversed. And the remnant needs to respond to this by being gracious according to the moral code of the Torah. So the Lord says, I once purposed to bring disaster to you when your fathers provoked me to anger. Now I have purposed to do good to Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. So don't be afraid, but you need to be careful to be my people and to behave yourselves as my people. Speak the truth to one another. Don't be dishonest with each other. Now that I am blessing you, use this as a time in which you can actually live according to my commandments. Render in your gates judgments that are true. In other words, when there comes a civil court, for instance, which is something settled in the city gates, then give true judgments. Make for peace. Do your best to serve the Lord in the way that He wants you to serve Him. And don't devise evil in your heart against one another. Don't falsely swear to each other. Those are the kinds of things I hate, says the Lord. The eighth promise, which begins in verse 18, the word of Yahweh Sabaoth came to me saying, thus says Yahweh Sabaoth, the fast of the 4th month, 5th, 7th, and the 10th shall be to the house of Judah seasons of joy and gladness and cheerful festivals. Therefore, love, truth, and peace. Here finally is the answer to the question that they posed back in chapter 7. Should we continue fasting because of the destruction of the temple and the loss of Jerusalem? Now the word of the Lord through Zechariah is, you may continue to observe those days, the 10th month, the 5th month, the 4th month, and so on. You continue to observe those days, but now instead of days of mourning for the past or grieving over your loss, these should become days of celebration, days of joy, because now what is being restored to you is what you once lost. And so the days may continue to be observed, but they are going to change in their character from grief to joy. The 9th of the new promises concerns the new temple. This begins in verse 20, where Yahweh Sabaoth says, even the inhabitants of many cities will go to one another and say, let's go and entreat the favor of the Lord and seek Yahweh Sabaoth. And I'm going too. And many people and strong nations will come to seek Yahweh Sabaoth in Jerusalem. Well, this is the idea that the new temple that they are building is linked to God's promise and ideal that the nations of the world, all of the nations, would come and would worship the Lord. This actually goes all the way back to the idea that you find initially in God's promise to Abraham, that in Abraham's seed the nations would be blessed. And so this new temple that they are building is part of God's future, part of His purpose to bring the nations to Him to worship. And finally, in the 10th promise, He capsulizes on that even more. For thus says Yahweh Sabaoth, in those days 10 men from the nations of every tongue shall take hold of the robe of a Jew, saying, let's go with you, for we've heard that God is with you. It is in this verse that we find that the Jews actually are now going to be able to fulfill the ancient promise of God for the nations. Back in Genesis 12, the promise of God to Abraham was that I will bless you, I will make your name great, and in you all of the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, here in this 10th promise, that promise is going to be fulfilled to the nations, in which the blessing of Abraham is going to go to the nations. They will take a hold of the descendants of Abraham and say, I'm with you because I've heard God is with you. And they will be joined to the people of God. So these 10 promises point to the great redemptive work that God intended for the earth. They stretch ahead far beyond the building of the Second Temple, even into the New Testament, the coming of Jesus, and the preaching of the gospel to the nations. In rebuilding this temple then, this remnant community had a role to play in God's long-range purpose. The time that they were putting in to build the temple was not wasted time. It was part of the great plan that God had that eventually would draw in the nations as people who would come to worship Him. And the implications would stretch all the way to the coming of the Messiah.